Ever since Google Chrome came out in 2008, it has dominated the market. The integration with Google services and extensions has made it the go-to browser for most people. But there are still some people who use other browsers. Some of these choices are self-explanatory. For example, the second most popular desktop browser is Safari, which is not surprising given that it comes pre-installed on Mac. The same thing can be said about Microsoft Edge and Internet Explorer as well. But what about Firefox? Firefox currently controls 7.69% of the market, and it doesn't come pre-installed on Windows, Mac, or any mobile device. So people who are using Firefox had to go out of their way to get it, and they chose it over Chrome. And given that billions of people around the world use PCs, Firefox's user base works out to a total of 362 million users. At first, it might be easy to write off this segment as people who are anti-big tech and anti-Google. But if you take a closer look, you'll see that this isn't just some Google hate club. In fact, there are several subreddits that discuss why Firefox is the best browser. These people aren't using Firefox because they don't want to use Chrome. They're using Firefox because they want to use Firefox. This story becomes even more interesting when you realize how Firefox is funded. Firefox is a non-profit organization and they don't run ads or have any other internet-based services. So they're virtually completely funded by donations, and by far their largest donor is actually Google. In fact, last year, Mozilla pulled in a total of $500 million, out of which $450 million came from Google. Before Google got involved, Mozilla was actually slashing their workforce and scaling back their operations. So, in a way, Google actually saved Firefox when they could have just let them die and absorbed their market share. So, here's why hundreds of millions of people still use Firefox and why even Google supports Firefox. To understand why people still use Firefox, we'll have to take a look back at why people started using Firefox in the first place. Taking a look back, the roots of Firefox actually date back to the early 1990s to a company called Netscape. A lot of you watching may not even be familiar with Netscape, but back in the day, they were by far the most dominant internet browser. But all of this would change when Microsoft launched Internet Explorer. Internet Explorer came bundled with Windows, so when people bought new computers, they just started using Internet Explorer instead. Microsoft would actually end up facing an antitrust lawsuit for this practice, which almost split up the company, but that's a whole other story. Anyway, as Netscape continued to bleed market share against Microsoft, they simply couldn't keep up the fight. Microsoft had an advantage in basically every avenue. They had more brand recognition, more trust, more developing power, and more marketing power. So, in a last-ditch effort, Netscape would try to make their browser open source in 1998. The idea was that tens of thousands of open source developers could help them take on Microsoft. They codenamed the project Mozilla, which was a combination of the words Mosaic and Godzilla, and they were off to the races, or at least that's what they hoped for. In reality, they would run into a bunch of roadblocks. For one, the browser was rather complex for being an open source project, which heavily limited the number of developers who could help out. And secondly, Netscape couldn't even open source much of the browser because a lot of the code was licensed from third parties. They fumbled around like this for several years, but eventually in June of 2002, they would make the hard decision of scrapping everything and starting from scratch. Initially, the project was called Mozilla Phoenix, but this got them into trouble with the BIOS manufacturer, Phoenix Technologies. So they would switch their name to Mozilla Firebird, but this simply created confusion with the database software, Firebird. So eventually, they switched their name to Mozilla Firefox, and the first official release of the browser came in February of 2004. While Firefox faced quite a bit of challenges in actually launching, the first few years after launch were actually rather smooth. By 2008, Firefox would control 30% of the market, and if it wasn't for Chrome, Firefox probably would have taken majority control. The reasoning for this was quite simple. Firefox was built off the success and back of Netscape, which was at one point the most popular browser in the world. Firefox was essentially just a rebranded, revamped, open-source modern reboot of Netscape. So, choosing to use Firefox over the rapidly aging Internet Explorer was a rather easy choice. Not to mention, the public distaste for Microsoft was rather high throughout the early 2000s, as they were seen as the evil monopoly that you might associate with Google or Facebook today. But despite all this progress, Firefox would be stopped dead in its tracks with the launch of Chrome. Google Chrome didn't launch with anything groundbreaking per se. It was basically just Firefox, but from Google with a few little upgrades here and there. For example, they embraced the idea of sandboxing, which made individual tabs independent of each other. This made it so that if one tab crashed, the entire browser wouldn't crash. Tweaks like this made Chrome marginally faster and more stable than Firefox, but this wasn't anything that Firefox couldn't catch up to. Catching up wouldn't really help Firefox though, because the speed and stability weren't really the selling factors of Chrome. While they definitely made the experience better, the real selling factors were the Google ecosystem and developer support. Starting off with the Google ecosystem, this is self-explanatory. Chrome beautifully integrated with the Gmail accounts, Google Maps, Google Drive, Google's Office products, and of course, Google.com itself. And it's kind of similar to the whole Apple ecosystem with iCloud, iMessage, and Apple Music. As people became more reliant on Google's various services, they tended to switch to Chrome. But it wasn't just users who preferred Chrome either. Developers were also big fans of Chrome because it was built with the developers in mind. Chrome was built around the standards of HTML5, and it even passed the ACID 1 and ACID 2 tests from day one. If you're not familiar with these tests, they're basically just a way of gauging how well a particular browser can display aspects of HTML. Anyway, as developers started jumping onto their Chrome bandwagon, websites became more and more optimized for Chrome. And pretty soon, it got to the point that if you wanted the best browser experience, you used Chrome. Firefox was never that far behind, but for the average person, there was really no reason to ever choose Firefox over Chrome. This was only made worse by Google's marketing power. Google didn't even need to pay anyone to market Chrome. They could just advertise Chrome across all of their existing services for free, and that's exactly what they did. In the meantime, Firefox didn't do much to differentiate themselves, so they basically became an open source version of Chrome. We should also mention that many parts of Chrome itself were already open source, so that wasn't a very big advantage for Firefox either. With all the cards stacked against Firefox, they inevitably started losing market share year after year, bringing us to where we are today. If Chrome is so good, why do people still use Firefox? Well, there's actually several legitimate reasons for this, starting with computational requirements. It may not seem like it, but Chrome is actually rather computationally intense, especially for being a browser. Remember how we talked about how Chrome treats each tab separately? Well, it turns out that this requires a bunch of RAM. Firefox does this to an extent as well, but they limit the number of processes to 6 at a time. So if you have 20 tabs open on Chrome, you'll have 20 RAM processes. But if you open 20 tabs on Firefox, you'll only have 6 RAM processes, which is much kinder to lower spec devices. Aside from offering better support for lower spec devices, Firefox also offers better support for older operating systems. For example, Chrome is dropping support for Windows 7 in February of 2023, which doesn't make any sense. While it has been 13 years since the launch of Windows 7, it was still the second most popular operating system in the world as of the end of 2020. So you would think that Google would continue pouring some money into Windows 7 support, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Now, to be fair, Firefox's extended support also ends around the same time. But if neither of them support your OS, it makes more sense to go with a browser that's friendlier to older computers with lower specs. Moving on from performance-related benefits, we have privacy benefits. It's no secret that Google makes most of their money by collecting your data and serving relevant ads. Firefox, on the other hand, is a non-profit and doesn't track your browsing history. By default, Firefox also blocks cookies, and they generally have substantially better privacy features than Google, given that they don't have anything to gain from making these policies loose. Now, it should be noted that Firefox does not wipe out data collection altogether. If you go to google.com on Firefox, Google can still collect a bunch of data. But if you use Firefox in combination with something like DuckDuckGo, then you actually have a chance at protecting your privacy. But all of this brings up the question. If Firefox is a competitor to Google and they're actively working to reduce how much data companies like Google can collect, why in the world is Google funding Firefox? Well, the official answer is so that Google can be the default search engine on Firefox, but this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. First of all, if a significant portion of Firefox users are going out of their way to use Firefox over Chrome, I bet that they're also likely to go out of their way to use a different search engine over Google. And secondly, if Google were to stop supporting Firefox, then Firefox would likely just lose market share which Google can absorb. So it seems like the play for Google would be to just pull the plug on Firefox and increase their own market share. So why don't they do this? Well, the answer is to protect their monopoly. Here's the thing, regardless of whether Google controls Firefox's market share or not, Chrome is already a monopoly. I mean, they control 77% of the market. So either way, they'd be a monopoly. But if they eliminated Firefox, they'd be a monopoly at risk. Right now, when antitrust regulators question them, they have some plausible deniability with Firefox. They can talk about how they're single-handedly holding up this open-source project and how they're encouraging competition. If they were to let Firefox die, however, that case wouldn't be nearly as strong. At the end of the day, the initial popularity of Firefox can be attributed to its roots in Netscape and its superiority to Internet Explorer. But with the launch of Chrome and the growth of the Google ecosystem, people have chosen Chrome over Firefox by far. Nonetheless, a non-negligible portion of the population still uses Firefox because it often works better with older computers and operating systems, it's open source, and it's way more privacy-driven. And for the first time, Firefox is actually starting to lean into its differences like its privacy features instead of just being an open source Chrome. And as people become more conscious of data privacy, we may just see another surge in Firefox popularity, but we'll just have to wait and see. What's your favorite browser and why? Comment that down below. Also, drop a like if you would like for Chrome to see some serious competition. And of course, consider checking out our Discord community to suggest future video ideas and consider subscribing to see more questions logically answered. Until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.